The metaphors that the Bible, that Jesus used to describe man's intimacy with God's intimacy with man, is overwhelming. It's invigorating. And it reveals truths that are easy to overlook in this world that seems to be caught in chaos and absolute despair. I'm reflecting this morning on John chapter 10. John chapter 10 is one, it includes one of the I am statements of John's gospel, the 7 I am statements. And it brings up a metaphor that doesn't always seem to translate into the 21st century. And yet it is one that holds within it an intimacy and a power and a potency that we should not only not overlook, but we should meditate on and dwell on. John chapter 10 says this, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees," Jesus is speaking, "anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber." Why? Because the sheep and the shepherd have no reason to climb over the gate. Well, the sheep have no ability. No, they go through the gate. They don't climb over the fence. They go through the gate. But a thief and a robber, they're climbing the fence because they're not supposed to be there, because they do not have access to the gate. Or if they do have access to the gate, they are afraid they're going to disturb the shepherd. And that's what Jesus starts to bring up in verse 2. "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice." What I want you to focus in on is the intimacy of this metaphor. He says the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name. He has named them. And when he speaks, they hear him. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. He doesn't just send them out. He doesn't just throw them out. He leads them out. He guides them out. He moves and they follow. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him. Why? Because they know his voice. My oldest son Zion he's deepening in his faith. He's wrestling with the question, how do I hear the voice of God? How do I know it's God's voice and not my own? And I'm working with him, and God love him. He wants it to be simple. He wants it for me to say, when you hear this, then you know God speaks. And when you don't hear that, then you know God is not speaking. But I told him, I said, son, it is not that easy. I said, early on, it's going to be difficult. Early on, it's going to be frustrating. But that's the reason why you have other people who are in the faith, like me, like your mom, like your uncles and your aunts, that have walked with Jesus for many years and have learned to hear his voice. And here's the thing I know about the Lord. I said, he speaks to each of us in a way where each of us can hear him. And I told Zion, I said, what you're doing right now is the right thing. You're praying, you're listening, you're discussing, you're wrestling. And over time, you will learn to hear his voice. I was referencing this passage. Because if you're a sheep that follows Jesus and somebody comes to you and says, well, the Lord told me to divorce my wife. I've had someone do that before. And my initial response to them was, that doesn't sound like the voice of my Lord. The person went on, they were saying, I feel like the Lord's called for me to divorce my wife because God just wants me to be happy and she doesn't make me happy. And I just said, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't sound like the voice of my shepherd. Why? Because after years of following him, over time, you learn to hear his voice. You know his voice. It's kind of like walking in a crowded room and hearing your spouse or one of your children or one of your good friends say your name. How is it possible that in this big crowd of noise of people, you hear their voice. You hear your name. Why? Because you have an intimacy with them. And then he says in verse 5, but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Hey, Christians, sometimes I get confused with the way that Christians are acting, because it seems like that they are in tune with a voice that's just simply not the Lord. Especially during political seasons, am I right? And the way they treat each other and the way they talk about other people on social media, I'm going, that doesn't sound like the voice of our shepherd. No, there's an intimacy with the voice. There's an intimacy with the shepherd. Verse 7, therefore Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. You see, the shepherd isn't just someone that leads. It isn't just someone that calls. The shepherd is the gate. For the shepherd is the one that sleeps in the doorway to make sure that no sheep go out and that nothing comes in without his permission. That's why Jesus says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and doesn't own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. But I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. Why? Because there is an intimacy with Jesus that we often overlook. One of my good friends was preaching a sermon this past Sunday, and I happened to be in the audience. And he was preaching from Psalm 23, and he made a powerful observation that I want to pass on to you. Psalm 23, it's very familiar. It's actually the passage that Jesus is invoking in John chapter 10. Psalm 23 says, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, or I lack nothing. The good shepherd. And then in verse 2, it says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. My friend, during the sermon, he talked about when he was a young minister and he went to a church that was filled with farmers, and he preached on Psalm 23. And he said, as one of his elders usually would do, he came up to him and he said, hey, great try this morning, but I want you to come to lunch with me. And as he went out to lunch with this elder, he quickly realized, oh my goodness, this elder, he is a shepherd of herdsmen, of sheep. He's a herdsman. He and his cattle is sheep. And he began to talk about sheep. And he began to talk about Psalm 23. And one of the things that he said about verse 2 is this. He says, sheep don't lie down. They are stubborn. They refuse to lie down unless they are completely content, unless they feel completely protected and they have a full belly. You see, that elder had an intimacy with Psalm 23 because he was a shepherd. And we have an intimacy with the Lord whenever we spend time with him and learn to hear his voice. Here's my challenge for you this week. Meditate on this metaphor of being a sheep to a shepherd. Do you hear him when he calls your name? Do you thank him for being the gate? And do you completely trust him to the point where the protection is so profound and his provision is so powerful that you're able to lay down in green pastures and enjoy the presence of the intimate Father? I love you guys. Have a good week.